The workman reached the ballroom last. For a lifetime, it had belonged to the largest private house ever raised in New York, home to a family once richer than the United States Treasury, its name carved above the door to promise it would stand 1,000 years. In 1927, they swung the iron ball through it, and within 40 years the whole marble mountain came down onto carts, and a store rose where the Great Hall had stood. One of that family had once been quoted telling a reporter, "The public be damned." Now the public strolled past the rubble to shop, and the Vanderbilts were only the first. The same age that raised 3 great dynasties higher than any American had climbed was quietly taking all 3 apart with the machinery that built them. How does a golden age come to devour the families who made it? I am walking you through the whole of it, from the marble going up to the wrecking ball coming down. If you want to follow these 3 dynasties all the way to the rubble, subscribe now and stay close. Chapter 1. The Age That Built Its Own Coffin. America tore up every crown it could find, and then spent 30 years building an aristocracy out of marble and money. The country had been founded on a plain promise that no man stood above another by birth, that titles were the rot of the old world, that a free citizen bowed to no lord. Then the war ended, and the money came, and the promise bent under the weight of it. The Civil War closed in 1865, and out of its smoke rose the greatest heap of private wealth the Republic had ever held. The engine was the railroad. Track spread across the continent like veins under skin, from about 35,000 miles at the war's end to more than 200,000 by the turn of the century. Around the rails clustered the other machines of the new money, steel for the rails and the bridges and the towers about to climb over the cities. Oil, first for the lamp and later for the engines still to come. And the banks of New York, which lent to all of it, and in the end swallowed most of it. 2 writers, Mark Twain among them, gave the age its name in a novel of 1873. They called it the Gilded Age, and they did not mean it as praise. To gild is to lay a thin skin of gold over a cheaper metal. The name was a warning about what lay beneath the shine. The speed of it had no precedent anywhere. A man born in a plank cabin could, before his hair went white, hold more wealth than a European kingdom. Riches that had taken the old houses of England 4 centuries to gather were heaped up along one island of New York in 20 years. It gave the age the feel of a fever, and the men who caught it were sure the heat would last forever. They had reason to be sure. Nothing in the ledgers pointed down. The men who rose in it were something the country had no word for. Europe had its aristocrats, and their power rested on land held for centuries and on charters granted by kings. These new men held no charters and bowed to no king. They had built fortunes larger than the treasuries of European princes, and had done it in a single lifetime, out of nothing but nerve and iron and paper. The country reached for the old words anyway. It called them the Lords of Industry. It called them American royalty. It called the Vanderbilts a dynasty, because there was no plainer word for private citizens who owned this much of the world. And yet, for all the old words borrowed to describe them, these were an aristocracy with nothing underneath. A European house rested on law and land and time, on a settled understanding of who its people were, so that a family could lose its money and keep its rank for 100 years. The American fortunes rested on none of that. They were held purely as capital, as figures in a bank and shares in a company, with no crown to confirm them and no law of blood to carry them down. Strip away the money, and nothing at all remained. That was the secret shape of the whole age. An aristocracy resting on the one thing an aristocracy is never supposed to depend on, and insecure straight to the root. Under all the marble, the age carried a wound it never spoke aloud. The old families, the Knickerbocker gentry whose grandfathers had held New York when it was still a small place, looked at the railroad money and saw dirt under the fingernails. Trade. Grease. New. A European duke could be poor as a church mouse and still outrank any Vanderbilt in any room that mattered, because the duke had centuries at his back and the Vanderbilt had only cash. That was the founding hurt of the whole age, and the great spectacle to come grew straight out of it. The new money owned everything a fortune could buy, and nothing to prove it belonged except the fortune itself. So it set out to buy the one thing that could not be bought, and it spent the rest of the age trying. There was an old saying in the country, older than the railroads, that people muttered at the sight of a great fortune. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first man builds in his workshirt, the second puts on fine clothes and displays, the third spends the last of it and pulls the workshirt back on. It was a peasant's proverb, a small, mean prophecy, and the age laughed at it. The saying was made for grocers and farmers, for men with a few $1,000s to lose. It could never reach a fortune the size of a national treasury. Fortunes like these were a new thing under the sun, too vast to spend, too heavy to move, built to stand as long as the pyramids. The men inside them were certain of it. They believed they were raising something that would never fall, and they were wrong in a way none of them could yet see. The same machine that lifted them, the money turned into spectacle, the fortunes and the marriages and the marble, would one day run in reverse. Every force that raised the dynasties was quietly a force that could erase them. The railroads that made the old Commodore rich would slide into other hands. The palaces built to shelter the name would help to devour it. The marriages meant to crown the daughters would carry the money out of the country and never bring it home. The golden machine had a second setting, and no one at the top could read the dial. For now, the dial pointed only upward. In the boardrooms and the drawing rooms and the long private rail cars rolling west, the men who owned the age believed the age was theirs to keep, and every account they read agreed with them. No one had ever taken a fortune like this apart, because no one had ever built one. The story of how it all came down begins with the man who built the largest of them, an old ferryman who died certain that money like his could never die. Chapter 2. The Men Who Bought the Country. Cornelius Vanderbilt died leaving a fortune larger than the money in the United States Treasury, and he was only the beginning. He died in January of 1877, an old man of 82, in a house on Washington Place, and the sum he left behind came to about $100 million, more than the federal government then held in its own vaults. He had started with a single flat boat carrying farm goods across New York Harbor when he was a boy of 16. People called him the Commodore, a naval joke for the steamships he later ran, and it stuck to a man who never wore a uniform in his life. Only in his 60s did he turn from water to iron, buying up the rail lines running north out of the city, welding them into the New York Central, driving one iron road from the harbor all the way to Chicago. He raised the first Grand Central to be its gate. And when he died, he did the thing that would set the pattern for the entire age. He refused to divide the money. He left almost all of it, about $95 million, to a single son, William Henry, on a hard and simple theory. Split a fortune among many children, and each child holds a share too small to matter, and within a few turns of the wheel, there is no fortune left at all. Keep it whole in one pair of hands, and it stays a power in the world. For one generation, the theory held, and held spectacularly. William Henry took the 100 million and roughly doubled it to near 200 million in fewer than 9 years, mostly by tightening his grip on the railroad and buying government bonds, and he died in 1885, reckoned the richest man alive. It was that same William Henry, riding in his private car in the autumn of 1882, who handed the Age its motto. A reporter had asked him about a fast mail train the railroad ran at a loss, and whether he kept it running for the good of the public. The words carried back across the country were three: "The public be damned." Only those three words are firmly his. The longer sentence the newspapers wrapped around them may well have been the reporter's own dressing, added to make a better story. But the three words needed no help. They fit the age too closely to let go of. A whole generation of men who owned the roads and the mines and the mills and regarded the public as weather, a thing to be endured and charged for. Those three words became the line the Age would be remembered by, whether or not any single man had ever meant them as a creed. The Vanderbilts were the loudest of the new fortunes, but not the oldest. Before the railroads there had been John Jacob Astor, a butcher's son off a boat from Germany, who made his first money in furs and then did the shrewdest thing anyone in America had yet thought to do with money. He bought Manhattan and held it. He bought the land only to own it and to wait, while the growing city rose up around his empty lots and made them priceless. By the time he died in 1848, he was called the landlord of New York, and his heirs did nothing cleverer, generation after generation, than collect the rents of a rising city. The Astor money did its work simply by sitting on the ground and waiting, which made it the most permanent seeming fortune of the age. Then there was the third kind of money, the kind that frightened people. Jay Gould was a small, quiet, sickly man with a black beard who built almost nothing and moved fortunes with paper. Where Vanderbilt laid rail and Astor held dirt, Gould manipulated. He printed stock by the wagon load to beat the Commodore himself in a war over the Erie Railroad. In 1869, he tried to close his hand around the entire gold supply of the country and nearly broke the national economy in a single day before the government dumped its own gold into the market and the scheme collapsed. Gould, quietly sold out ahead of the fall, walked away whole while other men were ruined at their desks. In time, he came to control something near a seventh of all the railroad track in the country, and the telegraph wires strung along beside it. He was the most hated man of the age, because his fortune seemed conjured out of other men's losses, wealth spun from ruin. They played by rules of their own making. A market was territory, to be seized and held. A rival was an enemy, to be starved out or bought up. The government was neither judge nor referee, but an instrument, to be captured with a bribed legislator here, a friendly judge there, a charter written to order. Rockefeller squeezed secret deals out of the railroads that made his rivals pay more to ship a barrel than he did, until they sold to him or sank. Gould treated a corporate charter and a printing press for stock as weapons of war. It was a hard, roaring, lawless way to build, and the men who won at it came to believe that winning had proved them right. Around these three loomed the men who set the ceiling for all of it. John Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil swallowed 9 in every 10 barrels refined in the country, and who would become the first man on earth worth 1,000 millions. Andrew Carnegie, who made the cheapest and best steel in the world and sold his company in 1901 for $480 million, folded into the first corporation ever valued above $1 billion. And John Pierpont Morgan, the banker king, who reorganized whole industries and owned them afterward, and who would twice stand in for a national bank the country did not yet have. Besides such sums, the Astor rents and the Gould schemes found their scale. This was the ceiling of private money in the world, and 3 American families were pressed hard against it. 3 fortunes, 3 methods, 1 faith. build it, hold it, or conjure it, the men who made these fortunes agreed on the single thing that mattered most. The money was earned. The money was theirs by right of nature. And the money would last. Some dressed the belief in the language of science and called their own survival the survival of the fittest. Others, like Carnegie, dressed it in scripture and called the rich man a trustee of God's bounty. Beneath the dressing lay the same conviction that a fortune this large had passed out of the reach of ordinary time and would run down the bloodline unbroken, the way a mountain runs down through the years. The Commodore had proved it could be done. One fortune, passed whole to one heir, held together against every force that pulls money apart. What none of them could see was how briefly the trick would keep working. For all that the money could buy, there was one door in New York it kept knocking on and could not open. It was guarded by a woman who had decided that money was the very thing that did not count. Chapter 3. 400 people who mattered. In a republic that had outlawed titles, one woman and one man built an aristocracy anyway and gave it a number. The woman was Caroline Astor, married into the landlord dynasty, who decided that since the country would grant no rank, she would manufacture one, with herself seated at the top. The man was Ward McAllister, a lawyer from Savannah with no great fortune of his own and a rare genius for snobbery, who supplied the rules and the theatre she needed. Between them, they took the raw fact of money and turned it into caste. Caroline Astor understood the power of very small things. In 1887, after a rival Astor wife died, she quietly changed the words engraved on her calling card. It had read, Mrs. William Astor. Now it read only Mrs. Astor, as though to announce that of all the Astors in New York, she alone was the Astor, the one who needed no first name to be known. Rank conjured out of the wording on a rectangle of stiff paper no larger than a hand. No king had granted it. She had simply printed it and dared anyone in the city to disagree, and no one did. McAllister supplied her a doctrine to go with the throne. It took 4 generations, he liked to say, to make a gentleman, a convenient rule, since it kept the fresh railroad money waiting in the hall for the better part of a century. His rule for drawing up a guest list was shorter still. Only invite nice people. He sorted the whole city into 2 camps. The knobs were born to their place, old names resting on old money. The swells were the newcomers, who could buy their way in only by entertaining without limit, throwing dinners so lavish that society could not afford to look away. The entire machine ran on one idea, that some people counted and most did not, and that the counting could be controlled by the people already inside the room. He built the machinery to match the doctrine. In 1872, he gathered 25 gentlemen he judged beyond question, the patriarchs, and gave each of them a fixed quota of invitations to hand out, a few ladies and a few gentlemen apiece, to a series of subscription balls at Delmonico's. An invitation to a patriarch's ball became an official stamp of acceptability. Gatekeeping worked out as plain arithmetic. McAllister even set down the smaller laws, with a straight face, in a book he later wrote about society. A dinner invitation once accepted, he ruled, was a sacred obligation, and if a guest should die before the dinner took place, the guest's executor was bound to attend in his place. He meant it as only half a joke. The wall it built kept out far more than the railroad money. The list was closed against Jews and Catholics, against the newly arrived and the foreign, against every kind of money that still smelled of the shop, until the years could launder it. What looked from the ballroom like taste and breeding was, underneath, a careful engine for turning a fortune into a caste, and for keeping most fortunes forever on the wrong side of the door. It dressed exclusion in the manners of a gracious world. Beyond the lists and the balls ran an unwritten code that governed everything, and knowing it was itself the proof of belonging. There was a correct address to hold and a correct architect to hire, a correct box to keep at the opera, a correct hour to dine, and a correct order in which the foods of the season came to the table. A newcomer with all the money in the world could still betray herself with a single wrong fork, or a house on the wrong street, or a gown a season too late. The code could not be learned in a hurry, which was the whole point of it. It was designed to take a lifetime and to shut out anyone who had not been raised inside it from the cradle. Then, in 1888, McAllister said the thing that outlived him. A reporter asked him how large fashionable society truly was, and he answered that there were only about 400 people in fashionable New York. "Step outside that number," he said, "and you strike people who are not at ease in a ballroom, and who make other people not at ease." The figure caught fire at once. A story grew up around it, repeated ever since, that 400 was the exact number of guests who could fit inside Caroline Astor's ballroom, so that the walls of a single room fixed the borders of an entire class. Historians treat that story as legend. The number appears to have been all but invented, chosen because it sounded round and exclusive. And when McAllister was finally pressed, in 1892, to publish the actual list of the 400, the result was very nearly comic. He handed the names to the newspapers, and there were not 400 of them. There was something closer to 300. Some were misspelled. Some wives and husbands were left off entirely. And several people on the definitive list of who mattered in New York were, by the time it went to print, already dead. The register that claimed to hold the only names worth knowing could not keep its own members straight. The instrument that enforced all of it was small enough to tuck inside a glove. It was the calling card. A lady left her card at a great house. If the house returned a card of its own, the two were equals, and the door stood open between them. If no card came back, the message was delivered without one word being spoken and could never be answered, because officially nothing had happened. No insult had been given. No cut had been made in public. There was only silence and an empty tray by the door. That was the beauty of the thing for the people who held the power. Exclusion that left no fingerprints. A wall that could be raised and denied in the very same breath. For years that wall held firm against the largest fortune in America. The Vanderbilts had the railroads and the 100 millions, and still could not get past Caroline Astor's door, because railroads were trade, and trade was new, and new was not nice. It counted for nothing that a single Vanderbilt could have bought the whole Astor fortune twice over. The entire purpose of the card, and the list, and the 4 generations was that money was precisely the thing they were built to keep out, at least until enough time had passed to scrub the grease from it. The insult landed exactly where it was aimed. A family that could buy anything on earth had found the one room it could not enter. For all its railroads and its 100 millions, it was made to wait in the hall, like a tradesman at the kitchen door. And the waiting bred a fury that would remake the whole face of New York. And it was not a family accustomed to being told no. So the new money prepared an answer, in the only language that no drawing room could refuse to hear. It began to build. Chapter 4. They built a wall of marble. Barred from the old drawing rooms, the new money answered the only way it knew how, in limestone and marble, built to last 1,000 years. If the door would not open, the family would raise a door so grand the whole city had to walk past it. Along Fifth Avenue, on the open blocks above the older houses, the Vanderbilts began to build a line of palaces the newspapers named Millionaire's Row, and its heart, thick with a single family's houses, they called Vanderbilt Row. Stone put forward as an argument. Every column and carved lintel said one thing to the old families who had shut the door. The Vanderbilts were not going anywhere. The first shot was fired in 1882. William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt and set him to raise a French chateau in grey limestone at the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. The papers called it the Petit Chateau, and the reported cost ran to some $3 million, though every figure the newspapers printed for these houses should be held loosely, as guesswork dressed up as fact. The place looked 500 years old the day the scaffolding came down. That was the whole point. A brand new house built to wear the face of an inheritance, a past manufactured in stone, standing on a street where a farm had grown cabbages within living memory. The same year the patriarch built his own. William Henry Vanderbilt, the son who had doubled the Commodore's money, raised one long brownstone pile a few blocks down that held 3 separate houses beneath a single roof, one for himself and one each for 2 of his married daughters, so the clan could live pressed together behind one wall. The press called it the Triple Palace. He poured much of the reported $2 million into the rooms inside, filling them with paintings and marble and carved wood until his interiors were talked of in newspapers across the country, a headquarters for a bloodline, raised in the shape of a house. The materials came from across the world to prove the point. Marble arrived by the ton from Italy. Oak and walnut were carved by craftsmen brought over for the work. Whole rooms were bought out of old European houses and rebuilt inside the new ones, so that a family barely 2 generations from a ferry landing could dine beneath ceilings that had once hung above French counts. Hunt, the architect the great families all wanted, had trained in Paris and knew exactly how to give a railroad fortune the look of an ancient line. He built them their past to order, in the best stone that money could buy. The crown of the whole avenue, though, belonged to Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest grandson, the one who carried the family name most gravely. He began his house in 1883 and went on enlarging it for a decade, buying the land beside it and building over that too, until the house swallowed the entire block front and became the largest private home ever raised in the city of New York. It ran on something near 37 servants living inside its walls. A man had bought a whole city block so that no rival could ever build higher on that corner. The house was a fortress in a war waged with limestone, and the enemy it was raised against was the old fear that the family did not truly belong. And over the door of that great house, the family did the thing that gives the whole age away. It cut the name into the stone, carved deep into the lintel above the entrance, chiselled into the very block, too heavy to lift down or paint over, so that anyone who passed would read it and know who had built here and meant to stay. The carving was a promise made to time itself. Stone was chosen because stone does not rot or burn or blow away. And a name in stone was a name that would still stand 1,000 years on when the grandchildren of the grandchildren came and went beneath it. That was the true purpose of the house. It was raised as a claim to permanence, an aristocracy declared in rock because no blood could grant it. The family could not have seen the cruel joke folded inside the choice. Stone does outlast the men who cut their names into it. The lintel would still be sound and square long after the money had drained away, and in the end it was the name that would fail, and not the marble. The block over the door would outlive the Vanderbilt carved upon it. They had reached for the most permanent thing they could find to hold the least permanent thing they owned, which was their place in the world. These were not houses in any ordinary meaning of the word. A family of 4 might rattle about 100 rooms tended by an army of servants, closing off whole wings, heating empty halls for show. The house existed to be seen from the street and read like a coat of arms. It said to the Astors and the Knickerbockers, who had drawn the line that the line had failed, that the new money had built itself a seat no calling card could deny. And it worked. Stone could not be snubbed. A palace could not be quietly left off a list. The Vanderbilts had found the one argument the old families could not answer with silence, and they made it in marble, up and down the grandest avenue in America. And once one Vanderbilt built, the rest could not stand still. A grander house went up, and the family beside it answered with a grander one, until the avenue became a slow race in limestone with no finish line, each palace raised partly to shame the last. Money that might have gone back into the railroads and the mills went instead into cornices and ballrooms and marble stairs, poured into stone that earned nothing and cost a fortune to keep warm. It was display turned into an arms race, and no one dared be the first to stop. Even the old money moved in the end. Caroline Astor herself, who had frozen the Vanderbilts out of society, in time gave up her downtown house and raised a double mansion far up Fifth Avenue, modelled on a French royal chateau, with a ballroom said to hold some 1,200 guests, a pointed answer to the old room that had held only 400. The throne had followed the railroad money uptown. Even the woman who had drawn the line now lived on the far side of it. But there was still a rank that no amount of marble could buy on American ground, a thing older than any fortune, and to reach for it, the great families turned their eyes across the ocean. They began to trade their daughters for it. Chapter 5. The daughters sold for a crown. If a title could not be bought at home, it could be bought abroad, and hundreds of American daughters became the currency. In America, the new money had learned that it could raise a palace, but not purchase a rank. There was no king to grant one, and no old family that would. Across the Atlantic, the problem solved itself, because Europe had ranks to spare, and no money left to keep them. From the middle of the 1870s, a long farm depression, driven by cheap American grain, had gutted the incomes of the British landed lords, whose wealth was locked up in estates that now cost more to hold than they returned. The roofs leaked, the debts climbed, and the titles stayed grand. An American bride with a railroad fortune behind her could clear the debts and mend the roof and carry home a coronet in exchange. The market that grew up between the two shores ran with the steady rhythm of a grain exchange. The numbers were large enough to look like trade, because trade is what they were. One directory of the day counted 454 American women married to titled or aristocratic foreigners across the span of the market. Another reckoning put more than 100 British aristocrats, among them 6 dukes, with American wives in the years between 1870 and the First World War. One modern historian estimates that close to 500 American women married European nobles in that time, carrying dowries worth, in today's money, more than $4 billion, a river of American cash running east into the mortgaged great houses of England and France. There was even a printed directory of eligible titled bachelors, so an American mother with a daughter to place could shop the field from a list. The exchange was written down by lawyers, because far too much money moved for it to be left to the young people themselves. The instrument was the marriage settlement, drawn on both sides of the water, deciding exactly how the bride's fortune would be spent and who would hold the strings. This mattered because of an old rule of law called coverture, under which a married woman's property passed into her husband's hands, to keep or to spend as he saw fit. British law had begun to soften the rule, but the great matches still ran on settlements and trusts, and the shrewder American fathers, wary of pouring a fortune into the pockets of a spendthrift lord, began to demand trusts that locked part of the money away where a son-in-law could not reach it. The bride herself was the thing carried across the table, and she was very often the last person in the room consulted about the terms. For the daughters themselves, the trade could be bleak. Many were sent across an ocean at 19 or 20 to marry men they barely knew, into cold houses and colder families, valued first for the fortune stitched into the settlement, and only after for anything else. A girl might command millions on paper, and under the settlement her father and her husband had signed between them, control almost none of it. She was at once the richest and the most powerless person in the marriage, a fortune with a face, expected to produce an heir and grace a great hall and ask no hard questions about where the money went. Some found affection in time, many never did. The Gould fortune gave the age its sharpest lesson in what the market could do. Anna Gould, a daughter of the feared Jay Gould and heir to a fortune over $80 million, married a French count named Bonny de Castellane in 1895. The count was charming, penniless, and gifted beyond any rival at spending other people's money. He poured her Gould dollars into a pink marble palace in Paris, into balls and gowns and open, roaring extravagance, and it is commonly said he ran through something near $10 million before she divorced him in 1906. The American money bought a French title, a Paris season, and a legend of waste, and it bought no security at all. It simply flowed out and never came home. She kept back enough of the Gould fortune to marry a second French aristocrat afterward, so that even her escape from the first was spent on another title. Hers was the loudest case, but far from the only one. A Vanderbilt daughter was traded in the same decade for an English dukedom. Her millions settled on the Duke and his cold and crumbling palace. A Chicago heiress carried her father's dry goods fortune into a British marriage and ended as Vicereine of India, an American girl installed as the ceremonial First Lady of Britain's Indian Empire. Another American bride had already taken her dowry into an English marriage that would produce, in time, a son named Winston Churchill. One of the largest settlements on record, some $20 million, followed a New York heiress into a Scottish castle. Up and down the register, the same pattern repeated. The fresh American fortune married into the tired European name, each side buying what it lacked. The weddings themselves were watched like coronations. Crowds gathered outside the churches, the newspapers printed the guest lists and the value of the pearls, and a plain American girl walked out on the arm of a man the press could at last call a duke or a count of her own. For a season, the whole country got to pretend it had produced royalty. Then the couple sailed, and the fortune sailed with them. And what the crowds had cheered was really the sound of American money leaving America for good. And here, the age turned briefly to show its other face, though no one at the weddings could see it. The money was flowing out of the country at the very moment the country was making it fastest. Fortunes built in a single American lifetime were carried across the ocean and sunk into the upkeep of old estates that a new American-driven world was already making obsolete. Made at furious speed, converted into rank, and quietly consumed, the dollar princess marriages were the whole age in miniature, the wealth thinning on both shores even as the champagne was poured. The daughters had been sold for a crown, and the crowns would not hold their value. Yet the grandest prize of all was never in Paris or in London. It was the door on Fifth Avenue that had stayed shut, and years before Anna Gould ever met her count, one Vanderbilt wife had already forced that door open on a single night in the early spring. Chapter 6. The night the old door opened. On a March night in 1883, a single costume ball forced the proudest door in New York to swing wide. The house was the Petit Chateau, barely finished, its French stone still pale and clean. The hostess was Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam, and she had planned the night for months as a campaign rather than a party. Word went out through the city that the young Vanderbilts would open their new palace with a ball unlike anything New York had ever seen. 1,200 guests were asked. Quadrilles were rehearsed for weeks in advance. Whole dances drilled like a small army preparing for the field. And the reported cost of that one night came to something near $250,000, tens of thousands laid out for champagne alone, thousands more for hothouse flowers, a sum that would run to many millions in the money of today. The ball itself was a pageant staged to overwhelm. 1,200 guests came dressed as figures out of history and legend, as princes and shepherdesses, in costumes ordered months ahead from the finest houses in Paris. There were rehearsed quadrilles with names, the Star Quadrille, the Hobby Horse Quadrille, danced by squads of society's young people in matched costume. Servants had been hired by the score for the single evening, the great rooms banked with roses and orchids raised under glass, supper laid out on gold and silver for 1,000 guests and more. The hostess received her guests dressed as a Venetian princess. Every detail was aimed at one target, the breaking of the Astor grip on New York society, and every guest in those rooms understood the aim, whether or not a single word was ever said about it. There was one guest the whole ball was truly designed to reach, and she had not been asked. Caroline Astor's youngest daughter, a girl named Carrie, had joined the young people rehearsing one of the grand quadrilles, thrilled to be part of the great new event of the season. Then the word came, carried carefully to reach the right ears, that Miss Astor could not be invited after all. The reason was precise and cruel. Mrs. Astor had never called at the Vanderbilt house. She had never left her card, and by the very rules that Mrs. Astor herself had raised the whole social order upon, no card meant no acquaintance, and no acquaintance meant no invitation for her daughter. The girl was to be shut out of the season's great night by the exact instrument her mother had forged to shut out everyone else. The story that has been told ever since is that Caroline Astor surrendered, that her carriage rolled at last up to the new house on Fifth Avenue, and her footman stepped down and left her card, so that the invitation would come and her daughter could dance. Historians flag the tale as most likely apocryphal, too neat and too tidy to trust. But the thing underneath the tale is solid and documented. After that ball, Mrs. Astor received the Vanderbilts. The wall between the old money and the new, held firm for a full generation, came down, and the small square of pasteboard that had built the wall, that deniable little instrument of exclusion, became the instrument of surrender, passed at last the other way. That night was the victory the whole long arms race had been fighting toward. The railroad money had raised its palaces, sold its daughters for coronets abroad, spent without counting the cost, and now the oldest door in the city had opened to it, and old money and new poured together into one glittering world. There was no wall left to storm. The insult that had set the entire spectacle in motion, the founding wound of new money without a rank, had been answered and healed on a single March night. The Vanderbilts had done far more than join society. They had beaten it, and then folded it into themselves. After that night, the two worlds were one. The old Knickerbocker names and the new railroad names dined at the same tables now, shared the same boxes at the opera, and married one another's children. The 4 generations McAllister had demanded were quietly forgotten, because the money had refused to wait 100 years, and the money had won. Mrs. Astor kept her throne, but she kept it now over a court that had let the Vanderbilts in, and once the Vanderbilts were in, the wall could never be rebuilt against anyone. The gate, once forced, stayed open, and where the Vanderbilts had gone, the rest of the new money followed close behind. Every fortune that had been shut out of the old drawing rooms now held a map to get in, the palace and the ball and the open purse, and one by one the railroad and the mining and the banking families used it. The 400, meant to be a fixed and final list, began to swell with exactly the people it had been drawn up to keep out. No one at the ball could have named the price of what they had won. The families had proved that money could buy anything in America, even the one door that money was built to shut. And having proved it, they set no limit on themselves at all. The spending that had forced the door became the ordinary way of life, the balls larger each year, the houses grander, the seasons longer, the fixed costs enormous and always climbing. They had made display the whole meaning of their rank, and display would have to be paid for every year until the fortunes ran dry. The victory carried its own long debt, and the Age signed for it gladly, reading the paper as a boast and not a bill. The Age stood, that spring, at the very top of its own climb. It had made the greatest fortunes on earth and forced them past every closed door. It believed the rising would never end, that a thing built this high on money this vast could only go on higher. It did not look down, and so it never saw how far there was to fall. The wall was broken now, old and new poured into one, and the whole glittering machine turned its face toward the sea, toward a cliff on the coast of Rhode Island, where the merged aristocracy would raise its summer palaces and call them cottages, and hold the most dazzling season the country had ever known. The Age was climbing toward its zenith, and it was climbing there blind. Chapter 7. A Summer Capital of Cottages. For 10 weeks, every summer, the whole glittering machine packed itself onto a Rhode Island cliff and called its palaces cottages. By the middle of the afternoon, the carriages came out along Bellevue Avenue, matched teams groomed to a shine, coachmen and footmen in stiff livery sitting silent up front. The women behind them in gowns ordered from the House of Worth in Paris, turning their faces just enough to be seen and never quite enough to seem to want it. The parade rolled from the town down to the Ocean Drive and back again, the same route every day, the same order of precedence, a slow procession of who mattered. Below the cliff, the Atlantic worked at the rocks. Above it stood the houses, white and enormous, their lawns cut clean to the edge of the drop, and the families who owned them insisted, with perfectly straight faces, that these were only their little places by the sea. Newport had been a modest resort of wooden villas and sea air, a place of clapboard porches and ministers on holiday. In a single generation, the railroad money remade it into the summer capital of the Age. The season ran roughly 8 to 10 weeks, from the first days of July into September, and outside those weeks, the great houses stood shuttered and dark, staffed by a skeleton of caretakers, waiting. Everything that mattered in New York in the winter simply moved north for the summer and went on exactly as before. The same few hundred faces, the same hostesses deciding who was admitted and who was quietly left off the list. The days filled with the parade, the sea bathing at a fixed hour, the calls paid and returned, and each evening a dinner of 10 or 12 courses under a ceiling that had been bought whole in Europe and shipped across the ocean. A resort had become a court. Nothing about the season was accidental. Every call paid and every dinner given was a move in a long, silent contest for standing, refereed by a handful of women who had made themselves the judges of it. A hostess who meant to rise gave a ball that outshone the last one, and the woman she meant to overtake gave a grander one in answer, and the cost of each climbed with the rivalry until it lost all relation to sense. Stanford White built Rosecliff for one of these hostesses in 1902, a reported $2.5 million for a house whose chief purpose was its ballroom, the largest in Newport, raised expressly so that more people could be dazzled in one room than anywhere else on the avenue. The dinners ran to a dozen courses. The flowers came by the wagon load and were gone by morning. and the whole exhausting engine of it turned on a single question no one asked aloud: which family stood highest, and how the rest of the world could be made to see it. The word cottage was the age's own joke, and the joke had a barb in it. Barred for years from the oldest drawing rooms, the new fortunes had learned to answer in stone, and on the Newport cliffs they built their answer in the open, one palace after another, each meant to say that the family behind it had arrived and meant to stay 1,000 years. Richard Morris Hunt drew most of them. He had trained in Paris, and he gave his clients France, the France of dead kings, walls of imported marble and gilded rooms lifted out of European houses and set back up above American heads. The point was to be looked at and to be permanent. Comfort came a distant second. Marble House was the purest of them. William Kissam Vanderbilt gave it to his wife Alva to mark her 39th birthday, finished in 1892, and the reported figures alone carry the ambition of the thing. The house was said to have cost $11 million. Of that, some $7 million went to the marble alone, 500,000 cubic feet of it, quarried in Tuckahoe and in Italy and in the hills of North Africa, white and grey and a deep rose, hauled across an ocean to sheathe a summer house of about 50 rooms. 36 servants kept it running. A few miles up the shore, Ochre Court was reported to have cost $4.5 million, and a single season there took 27 house servants, 8 coachmen and grooms, and 12 gardeners. That was the arithmetic of one family at leisure for a summer. Grandest of all was the Breakers, finished in 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the head of the family. 70 rooms rose over 13 acres of ocean front, with 27 fireplaces and a great hall 50 feet high. A reported $7 million or more turned into stone, run by a staff of 30 to 40. The house faced the sea, the way a fortress faces a war that has not yet come. Behind every one of these houses ran a second household that no guest was meant to see. The servants came up weeks before the family, opening the shutters, beating the carpets, filling the larders, and they stayed weeks after to close it all down again. In the season, they woke before dawn and worked past midnight, laying fires in 27 cold grates, pressing gowns that would be worn once and never again, carrying trays up back stairs built narrow and hidden so the family need never watch them climb. They were paid little and housed in the hot rooms under the roof. Many of them spent their whole working lives in these houses, known to the family by a first name or by their office and by little else. The whole shining surface of Newport, the parade and the dinners and the cool marble halls rested on their labour, and the labour stayed cheap because a rigid order kept it cheap. That order looked as solid as the stone it served. It would prove the most fragile thing on the cliff. Seen from the middle of the 1890s, the age looked finished in the sense of perfected. 30 years earlier, the men who built these fortunes had been ferry captains and fur clerks and country boys with a gift for paper. Now their grandchildren summered on a cliff in houses of imported stone, married their daughters to European counts, and printed a list of the 400 people who were said to matter. The money had become marble, and the marble looked eternal. Everyone inside it believed the same thing, quietly and completely. It would last. The same machinery that had lifted them this high, the fortunes turned into spectacle. The display that proved a family belonged was running smoothly in every direction, and no one on the cliff could picture it ever running the other way. That was the peak. The age stood at the very top of its own curve and mistook the view for solid ground. And at the top, the display only grew. Each season the balls grew larger, the flowers came in by the ton, the sums climbed past anything a working household could imagine, as though sheer scale were a form of safety. One of those parties was about to grow too large for the age to forgive. Chapter 8. The Ball That Went Too Far. 14 years after the Vanderbilt ball, another one turned the whole country against the people throwing it. On the night of the 10th of February, 1897, the guests stepped down from their carriages outside the Waldorf Hotel on Fifth Avenue and walked into Versailles. The ballrooms had been made over into a copy of the palace of the French kings. The walls banked with hothouse roses, forced into bloom in the dead of a New York winter, the whole of it burning with electric light, still new enough to seem like a conjuring trick. Costumed footmen lined the stairs, and through the doors came kings and queens by the hundred, the richest people in America dressed as the crowned heads of a Europe most of their grandparents had fled. 1,200 invitations had gone out. Between 600 and 800 guests came, and nearly all of them came as royalty. By the accounts, 3 separate Catherine the Greats moved through the same rooms that night, and something close to 10 women had costumed themselves as Madame de Pompadour. Mrs. Astor arrived wearing a reported $200,000 in jewels. The gowns had been weeks in the making, some of them copied stitch for stitch from old portraits of dead monarchs, and the hostess, Cornelia Bradley Martin, had given the age precisely what it had come to want, which was more. Inside, the effect was overwhelming and meant to be. Powdered footmen in the livery of the old French court carried trays through rooms drenched in rose and gold. Dancers who had rehearsed their figures for weeks moved through them beneath the electric chandeliers. Diamonds that spent most of the year locked in bank vaults were out on every arm and throat, and the light broke on them and scattered across the walls. For a few hours, the richest people in the Republic that had abolished kings played at being kings in a false Versailles built to be pulled down at dawn, and told one another it was the grandest night the city had ever seen. In one narrow sense, they were right. It was the last night of its kind. The numbers were the point, and the numbers were staggering. The reported cost of the single night clustered around $369,000, and some accounts pushed it toward $400,000. 1,200 invitations had been printed. Between 600 and 800 guests attended. $200,000 in gems hung on one woman's neck and arms. 14 years earlier, the Vanderbilt ball had cost a reported $250,000 and been counted the triumph of the age. This one cost half again as much, and it fell into a wholly different world, for the ground had shifted under the dancers' feet. 4 years before, in 1893, the country had dropped into the worst depression it had yet known. Banks had closed by the hundreds and businesses by the thousands, and something near 1 in 5 working men had no work at all. The breadlines were real and close, a few blocks from the hotel doors. Into that winter, the Bradley Martins had sent 1,200 invitations to a costume ball at Versailles. The gap between the two pictures was the whole of the scandal, and everyone could see it at once. On one side of the boarded windows, men stood in breadlines in the February cold. On the other, 3 Catherine the Greats danced under forced roses. No preacher had to strain to draw the moral. The ball drew it simply by taking place. Cornelia Bradley Martin had an answer ready, and she offered it before anyone could ask. The ball, she explained, would help the poor. The short notice meant her guests would have no time to get their dresses from Paris, and would order them from New York houses instead. And that, she said, will give an impetus to trade. The dressmakers and florists and hairdressers of the city would eat because the rich had thrown a party. The public did not believe her, and the more she explained, the less anyone believed her, until the explanation itself became a joke told against the family that had offered it. From the pulpits, the clergy came down on the whole affair. One preacher laid out the arithmetic without mercy, that the rich put next to nothing in the collection plate and would then spend thousands of dollars on Mrs. Bradley Martin's ball. Newspapers ran the guest list beside the unemployment figures and let the reader do the rest. On the night itself, the city took no chances. The assistant police commissioner, a young man named Theodore Roosevelt, ringed the hotel with officers, and the ground floor windows were boarded over against the crowd that might gather to watch the kings and queens arrive. Inside, the orchestra played. Outside, the boards stayed up. The reckoning came in a form the family understood at once. The city assessors, having read the same papers as everyone else, sharply raised the taxes on the Bradley Martins' property. Stung by the taxes and the sermons and the cartoons, the couple did what the age's wounded so often did. They left. Within a few years, they had decamped to Britain, where a large American fortune still brought welcome and quiet, and where no one boarded the windows against them. For weeks afterward, the ball would not die in the newspapers. Cartoonists drew the guests as fattened royalty stepping over the poor. Editorial writers set the cost of the evening beside the wages of a labouring man and printed the sum for anyone to read. The Bradley Martins had meant to give the age a night it would remember, and they had, though not in the way they had planned. Their names would outlast their fortune, mainly as a warning. The couple who spent a small fortune on a single party and discovered, too late, that the public had begun to keep accounts. The ball is usually marked as the end of something. For 30 years, the great fortunes had set their spectacle out in the street and dared the public to look, and the public had looked with envy and a kind of awe. The Bradley Martin ball spent that awe in a single evening. The display that had made the fortunes admired now made them resented, and the resentment did not fade with the morning. The age had shown itself dancing in costume above a country out of work, and the country remembered. The door that the Vanderbilt ball had thrown open in 1883, the Bradley Martin ball had, in its way, pulled quietly shut, and behind it, the unembarrassed public display of the peak was already ending. The spectacle went on after that, quieter, more careful, glancing over its shoulder. But something had entered the mood of the age that its account books could not measure, a low unease it could not name. And in the same lit houses where the balls were planned, the very rich were giving their darker evenings to a stranger pursuit. They were trying to speak with the dead. Chapter 9. The Age That Talked to the Dead. At the height of its confidence, the Gilded Age spent its evenings in darkened rooms, trying to reach the people it had lost. The curtains were drawn against the street. A dozen guests sat around a table with their hands flat on the wood and their fingers just touching. And at the head of it sat a woman who was paid to listen. The lamp was turned low, or put out entirely. Someone spoke a question aloud, a name, a plea. And after a long silence, the answer came. A knock from somewhere in the dark, one rap for no and two for yes, or the table itself lifting under a dozen pressing hands. In the finest houses in New York, this passed for an evening's amusement, and for something a good deal more desperate than amusement. The movement had a birthplace and a year. In 1848, in a farmhouse at Hydesville in upstate New York, two young sisters named Fox reported strange rappings in the walls. A code, they said, by which the dead were trying to be heard. The story spread with a speed that seemed to belong to the coming century. Within a single generation, spiritualism had become a mass faith, with professional mediums, printed manuals, and séance rooms fitted quietly into respectable homes across the country. It climbed all the way to the top. After her young son died, Mary Todd Lincoln held seances in the White House itself, hoping to reach him. By the height of the age, the seance had become nearly as settled a fixture as the opera. Mediums grew famous and were passed from one great house to the next, like a rare performer, some of them making a comfortable living on a single wealthy family's hope. The rooms filled with the apparatus of contact, the trumpets said to carry a spirit's voice, the slates that wrote by themselves, the tables that tipped and knocked and rose. Money that could command almost anything on the earth was turned, night after night, toward the one country it could not buy its way into. Grief was the fuel, and the age had grief to spare. Behind the marble fronts and the printed lists, the same families that could buy almost anything could not buy back a dead wife or a lost child, and so they paid to reach them by other means. A medium was engaged the way one engaged a musician for the evening. Bereaved millionaires sat in the dark and asked the still air for a voice they knew. The century took children easily, and the finest care money could buy still lost them, and a nursery could empty faster than any fortune could fill it. The fortune that had raised a palace on a cliff could not raise the small body buried under a stone, and everyone in the circle understood that, and reached anyway. There was, from the start, a plain explanation, and in the end, it came from the sisters themselves. In 1888, Margaret Fox stood on a stage in New York and confessed that the rappings had always been a trick. She had made the sounds, she said, by cracking the joints of her toes, and she showed the hall how it was done. A sharp knock ringing out across the seats from a woman standing perfectly still. The demonstration was plain, and the papers carried it the next morning. Other celebrated mediums were caught in those same years, their hidden wires, their false trumpets, and their paid accomplices dragged one by one into the light. By any honest reckoning, the machinery of the séance was a fraud, and yet the fraud did not close the matter. The grief was real, whatever the raps had been. The exposure changed little that counted, because the thing the circles reached for had never truly turned on proof. Many thousands of people, rich and poor alike, kept sitting in the dark long after the confession, because what they wanted could not be argued out of them. An age awash in new money was also an age awash in a loss it could neither name nor master, and it spent its evenings feeling for the outline of something it had misplaced. There was something of the séance in the whole enterprise of the age. A society barely a generation old had raised itself palaces of ancient stone, a list of 400 names, and a code of manners as heavy as any court's. And it had done all of it to summon a permanence it did not truly hold, to make new money answer to the name of something old and settled and safe. The marble was a kind of table waiting to rise. The 400 were a circle holding hands in the dark. The age was reaching, with everything it owned, for a solidity that kept slipping just past the ends of its fingers. The unease ran deeper than any single grief. The age had inherited a proverb about itself, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The old folklore that the first generation makes the fortune, the second shows it off, and the third spends it and ends where the family began. In the drawing rooms they still repeated it, and still laughed, because it was so plainly a rule about other people, about weaker families, about the ones who had not built in marble. No one on the cliff believed the proverb was writing their own name, but the confidence had a thinness to it now, a listening quality, as though the age had begun to hear a knock it had not asked for. Everything rested on one belief, that the money was permanent, that fortunes lifted this high in a single lifetime would simply stay there, the way mountains stay. The age had never once watched one of these fortunes fall. It was about to. The reckoning it could not name already had a shape and very nearly a date, and it wore the plainest word in the whole language of money: a panic. Chapter 10. The first year, the money broke. In 1893, the machine that turned railroads into palaces did the one thing no one believed it could. It ran backward. The trouble surfaced first in February in the books of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, a line that had borrowed against next year's freight to pay last year's debt and then discovered that next year would not pay. The Reading collapsed into bankruptcy that February, the first of the great lines to fall. In May, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange dropped out from under the National Cordage Company, a rope trust that a week earlier had looked like one of the safest holdings a careful man could own. Cordage failed on the 5th of May. After that, the failures came in rows, day after day, the way water comes through a hull that has already opened. The panic fed on itself. Banks that had lent freely called their loans, and merchants who had lived on credit woke to find the credit gone. Depositors formed lines on the sidewalks to draw out their savings while the doors were still open, and every line that formed made the next bank weaker. Gold drained out of the Treasury toward Europe, and the nation's standing promise to pay its debts in gold began to look like a promise it might be forced to break. Currency vanished from ordinary circulation, carried home and buried in mattresses and cellars by people who no longer trusted a bank to be standing in the morning. The wreckage of that depression reads like a survey taken after a flood. Roughly 500 banks closed their doors for good. More than 15,000 businesses failed. Railroad companies operating a full quarter of the track in the country passed into the hands of receivers appointed by the courts, among them the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, and the Santa Fe, the transcontinental lines that had carried the age's confidence west. Unemployment climbed toward 1 working man in 5, near 19 in every 100 by 1894, and in the mill towns and the mining camps it ran far worse than that. The railroad, the organ at the center of almost every great fortune, was the organ that gave out first. The railroads were the wound because the railroads were the age. Nearly every great fortune had been made on them, or rested on them, or lent to them. And when a quarter of the nation's track fell into the hands of receivers, the shock ran straight up into the drawing rooms of the men who had built the marble houses. The Reading, the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Santa Fe, names that had meant certain wealth for 30 years, now meant lawyers and losses. The engine that had carried the age up was the first thing to fail on the way down. It was the worst depression the country had yet seen, and it did not lift for years. Men who had held steady jobs walked the roads between cities looking for work that was not there. And for the families at the very top, the ones who had taught themselves that the money was a law of nature, permanent as the granite they carved it into, the panic delivered a lesson they had not asked for. A fortune that a single February bankruptcy in Philadelphia could cut in half was a fortune that could, in principle, be lost entirely. The thought entered the age quietly. It never left. For the fortunes made of paper, the arithmetic was merciless. A railroad share was worth only what the next buyer would pay, and in 1893 there were sellers everywhere and buyers nowhere. Stocks that had underwritten mansions and marriages lost 1/3 of their value, then half, while the mansions and the marriages went on costing precisely what they had cost before. A man who had turned his wealth into limestone learned that limestone cannot be sold in a week to cover a debt. For the first time, the display that proved a family had arrived began, very faintly, to feel like a weight the family had to carry. The blow did not fall on every house at once. The Vanderbilt New York Central was among the soundest lines in the country and kept its trains running through the worst of it. The Astors, whose wealth lay under the streets of Manhattan as ground rent, barely felt the tremor at all. J. Gould had died the winter before, in December of 1892, leaving some $72 million and a coast-to-coast railroad ambition to his son, George, who now inherited both on the eve of the storm. The panic sorted the fortunes without warning, sparing the ones anchored in land and law, testing the ones built on debt and speed. Something in the age had shifted, and the people inside it half sensed it. The newspapers that printed the guest lists of the great balls now printed columns of suspensions and failures beside them. The doctrine that had held for 30 years, that these fortunes were earned and natural, and would stand as long as the mansions that housed them, met its first plain contradiction that winter. The Age noted the contradiction, filed it away, and went back to its dinners. But the thought had been planted, and it would grow. Into the wreckage stepped the one man whose nerve seemed equal to it. John Pierpont Morgan gathered the broken railroads into his own hands, cut away their reckless debt, and rebuilt them as tightly held trusts the newspapers called Morganized, until roads that had failed on their own answered to his committees in New York. Then he did something stranger still. In 1895, with the Treasury's gold reserve draining toward nothing and the government of the United States within days of breaking its own promise to pay its debts in gold, Morgan assembled a syndicate of bankers that lent the Treasury the gold to save it. A private citizen had underwritten the solvency of the nation. The republic that had abolished kings was rescued by a banker in a frock coat, and the rescue worked, which was exactly the trouble with it. It proved the system had no flaw of its own. Its stability now rested on the fortune and the temper of one aging man. And when the next panic came, as everyone who thought about it knew it would, the country would have to hope again that he was in the room and willing. The golden machine had learned to run in reverse. It had needed a whole Philadelphia railroad and a rope truss to start it this time. The next time it would need far less, and the man in the frock coat would be 14 years older. Chapter 11. One Man Against the Panic. In 1907, the entire financial system of the United States was held up by one 70-year-old man in a private library. The library stood on 36th Street in New York, a white marble building Morgan had raised to hold his books and his paintings, its inner walls hung in red silk. Through the last 2 weeks of October, the presidents of the city's banks and trust companies came to it after dark, summoned like courtiers to a palace, and Morgan kept them there through the night in the great rooms, while he sat apart at a small table, laying out one game of solitaire after another, waiting for the figures to tell him what could be saved. He was 70 years old, heavy and unwell, his ruined nose glowing in the lamplight. The wealth of the country waited on the temper of one tired man. The trouble began, as it had in 1893, in speculation gone wrong. A scheme to corner the shares of a copper company failed in the middle of October and dragged down the brokerage house and the banks that had backed it. Fear moved from one institution to the next by the oldest signal there is, the sight of a neighbor's money walking out the door. It reached the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in New York. And on the 22nd of October, the Knickerbocker's depositors drew out roughly $8 million in under 3 hours before the company closed its windows and suspended. A trust that had opened the morning as a pillar of the city was a ruin by afternoon. The trust companies were the loose brick in the wall. They took deposits like banks and lent like banks, yet they kept thinner reserves and answered to fewer rules, and in a panic, they were the first to go. When the Knickerbocker fell, its depositors' fear spread to every other trust in the city, and the lines lengthened at each one. The run was no longer about a single failed corner. It was about whether anyone could trust an American financial institution to open its doors in the morning. The men in the library that October were not there by choice. Morgan had gathered them because each of them held a piece of the thing that was failing, and he meant to make them save it together or watch it fall together. He worked them in shifts, sent for the numbers he needed, and refused to let the room break until the pledges were on paper. The signatures came near dawn more than once. A private citizen was conducting the rescue of the national economy from his own drawing room by summons and pressure and the sheer weight of his name, because there was no public body on earth with the authority to do it in his place. By the 24th of October, the panic had reached the floor of the New York Stock Exchange itself. The money to settle the day's trades had simply dried up, and the head of the exchange crossed to Morgan's office to tell him that without cash, the exchange would have to close, something it had almost never done. What followed became the legend of the age. Near midnight the day before, Morgan had pressed the presidents of the surviving trusts into pledging $8.25 million to hold the weakest of them upright. Now, with the exchange minutes from shutting its doors, he called 14 bank presidents into a room and drew $23 million out of them in about 16 minutes, enough to keep the market open to the closing bell. The Treasury added some $25 million of government money to the national banks. John D. Rockefeller put $10 million of his own into the National City Bank. The system did not have the money it needed. A handful of men in a few rooms found it anyway. There was something almost feudal in the spectacle. The government of a great modern nation stood aside while a private banker, elected by no one, decided which companies would live and which would die, and moved the money to enforce his verdict. He chose to prop up one great trust and let the Knickerbocker fall. He was right often enough that the country thanked him for it. But a gratitude that depended on the judgment of a single unaccountable man was its own kind of danger, and the cooler heads in Washington saw it plainly. The panic Morgan smothered in the city was, in the same weeks, doing slower and more permanent damage far to the west. George Gould had spent a decade stretching his father's railroads toward a line that would cross the continent, borrowing against each finished mile to pay for the next. The credit that vanished in 1907 was the exact credit his design depended on. His roads began their long slide toward the receivers, and though the collapse would take years to complete, it started here, in the same crisis that made Morgan a hero. The most feared fortune of the age had passed to a son the age was quietly breaking. 12 years separated the two rescues, and the distance between them measured how little had changed. In 1895, Morgan had lent the Treasury its gold. In 1907, he had refilled the banks from 14 men's reserves. Both times the Republic had been solvent only because one man in a frock coat was willing to make it so. The lesson could be read two ways, as proof of his genius or as proof of the country's fragility, and by 1907 the second reading had begun to win. Morgan was 70. He would not always be in the room, and one day he would not be alive at all. A country could not keep its footing on a floor made of a single man. So the country resolved to build a floor of its own. Out of the panic came a commission, and out of the commission came a law, and on the 23rd of December 1913, the President signed the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central bank to do by statute and forever what Morgan had done twice by force of will. It was the turning of one man into an institution. The state took up a power that had belonged in practice to a private dynasty of one, and it did not give the power back. That same year, the state reached toward the great fortunes from a second direction as well, toward the mountains of capital the whole age had been heaping up untouched, and this reach would cut far deeper than the first. Chapter 12. The Law That Taxed the Dynasty. For 50 years, the great fortunes had grown in the dark, untaxed, and in 1913, the dark ended. It ended with a single sentence. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified on the 3rd of February that year, granted the Congress the power to lay a tax on incomes from whatever source, and the whole structure of untouched accumulation the age had been built upon lost its foundation in one line of law. There was no drama in the wording. A clerk could have copied it in a minute. What it undid had taken the country a century to build, and what it began would take the dynasties apart for the rest of theirs. For the entire span of the great fortune building, income and inheritance had piled up essentially free of any federal claim. A man could earn $10 million in a year and owe the government nothing on it. He could die with $100 million and pass every dollar to a single heir with no toll taken at the grave. This was the hidden engine of the whole rise. Untaxed money compounds on itself, and money never divided by the state stays concentrated, and concentration was the very thing that made a Vanderbilt or an Astor or a Gould, rather than merely a rich family. The age had grown its dynasties in a greenhouse. The 16th Amendment opened the roof. The first tax was gentle enough that the men it aimed at could almost smile at it. The Revenue Act that followed in October of 1913 laid a normal tax of 1% on incomes above a modest exemption, with a surtax climbing to a top rate of 7% on incomes over $500,000. It touched perhaps 3 families in every 100. A fortune could absorb 7% and hardly feel the loss. But the principle had changed forever, and principles, once fixed in the Constitution, do not stay small. The rate was a suggestion. The power behind it was permanent. The change was as much moral as it was fiscal. For 50 years, the doctrine of the age had held that a great fortune was a private thing, earned and natural, and no business of the government that happened to share the country with it. Carnegie had dressed the idea in the language of stewardship, the millionaire as trustee of his own wealth. The income tax answered that the public had a claim on private fortune after all, written now into the founding law of the Republic. The men who had once treated the public as an irrelevance would spend the rest of the age filling out forms that told them precisely what the public was owed. The war made the power show its teeth. When the United States entered the fighting in 1917, it needed money on a scale no gentle tax could raise, and the rates climbed with terrifying speed. The Revenue Act of 1918 carried the top marginal rate from 7% to 77% on incomes above $1 million. In 5 years, the government's claim on the largest incomes had grown more than tenfold. The men who had shrugged at 7% now watched the state take better than 3 of every $4 at the top of their earnings. The greenhouse was open to the weather, and the weather had turned cold. The deeper blow to the dynasties fell on what they left rather than on what they earned. In 1916, the federal government introduced an estate tax, a levy on the fortune itself at the moment of death, beginning at 10% on the largest estates. It rose through the war years, and then, as the Depression sharpened the government's hunger, it climbed steeply, to 45% in 1932, to 70% in 1935, and toward a top rate of 77% by the start of the 1940s. This was the instrument built precisely to break the passing of wealth down a bloodline. Every time the head of a great family died, the state now stood at the graveside with its hand out for a share. The arithmetic of the change was stark. Before 1913, the federal claim on a great income was nothing, and on a great estate, nothing. Within 5 years, the top income rate stood at 77%. Within 2 decades, the estate tax reached 70%, then 77%. A patriarch who in 1877 could hand $95 million to one son intact would, 60 years later, watch the government take 3/4 of a comparable fortune from his heirs before they touched it. The money itself was the same money. What had changed was who was allowed to keep it. A dynasty is only a fortune that survives its founder again and again, without breaking. That survival had always depended on the money passing down intact and unshared. The estate tax made intact impossible. A family with several great houses, a name to keep up, and a death every decade or so now handed the government a fraction of its capital on a schedule as regular as the deaths themselves, and each fraction taken was a fraction that would never compound again. Over 3 or 4 generations, the effect was a slow bleeding, timed to the family's own funerals. Together with the central bank signed into law that same December, the income and estate taxes marked the year the state stopped standing outside the world of great fortune and stepped inside it. In a span of months, the government had claimed the power to steady the markets a Morgan had steadied by hand, and the power to tax the fortunes those markets threw off at their height and again at their owners' deaths. The private titan and the untaxed dynasty had been the twin pillars of the age. 1913 put a hand on each of them. The contrast with the founding generation was exact and cruel. When Commodore Vanderbilt died in 1877, he passed some $95 million whole and untaxed to a single chosen heir, on the deliberate theory that a fortune kept in one pair of hands survives and a fortune divided dies. His 20th century descendants had no such freedom. Each death in the family met a federal claim, and the fortune already split among 8 children, and their children was split again by the tax collector at every passing. Here the machinery of the rise turned most plainly into the machinery of the fall. The very thing that had built the dynasties, capital allowed to pile up untaxed and pass undivided, was the thing the new law was designed to undo. And the state was not the only force reaching into the great houses in these years. Something larger was already crossing the ocean toward them, a war that would empty the palaces of the one thing no tax had yet touched, the people who ran them. Chapter 13. The War That Emptied the Houses. The war that began in 1914 did to the great houses what no market could. It took away the people who ran them. In the basement of every marble palace ran a second house, unseen from the drawing rooms above, a warren of kitchens and sculleries and narrow stairs where an army of servants lived and worked. A wall of bells connected the two worlds, one bell for each grand room, and when a bell rang, a footman or a maid climbed the back stairs to answer it. The whole splendor overhead depended on those stairs and the people who climbed them. The war reached down into the basement and called them away. The numbers a single great house consumed in labor are hard to believe now. The breakers at Newport was run by 30 to 40 servants. Marble House kept 36. A single summer season at Ochre Court required 27 house servants, 8 coachmen and grooms, and 12 gardeners, all for a family that lived there 10 weeks a year. The largest of the Vanderbilt mansions in the city employed near 40 indoors alone. Every one of those positions paid a few $100s a year, and the whole system worked only because there were always more people who needed the wage than there were places to earn it. Cheap, endless service was the true foundation the palaces stood on, more so than the marble was. That foundation rested on a hard social fact. Domestic service was heavy, unfree work. Life lived at the sound of a bell in another person's house, and people took it because the alternatives were worse or did not exist. Much of the labor came from immigrants fresh off the boats and from the daughters of the poor, people with no better door open to them. As long as the class order held and the factory gates stayed narrow, the supply of hands never failed. The great house was a machine that ran on the certainty that there would always be someone glad of the work. The choreography those hands performed was relentless and invisible. Fires had to be laid and lit before the family woke, and the coal to feed them carried up by hand. Meals of a dozen courses had to appear and vanish on silent cue. Gowns were pressed, carriages harnessed, silver polished, floors scrubbed on the knees, all of it timed so the people upstairs never saw the effort that surrounded them. A great house presented itself as effortless, and the effortlessness was the most expensive thing in it, purchased with the labor of 40 people who were meant to be neither seen nor heard. The war broke the certainty underneath it all. When American industry threw itself into war production after 1917, it needed workers by the hundreds of thousands and paid them wages a great house would never match. A young woman who had carried coal up 4 flights for a ladies' fire could now stand at a factory bench for better money, shorter hours, and her evenings to herself. Young men who would have been footmen and grooms went into the plants or into the army. They left service in a flood, and when the war ended, a great many of them simply never went back. The great houses sent word out for footmen and parlourmaids and found the old flood reduced to a trickle, and the trickle wanted wages and half-days and a respect the old service had never granted. Some who left service did not come back because they could not. The same war that offered a factory wage also drew men into the trenches, and the trench did not return everyone it was given. A great house that had kept a dozen young men in livery before 1914 might count several of them among the dead by 1918. Their places at the door and behind the carriage never filled again. The war thinned the servant class the way it thinned every class, from the top of the age to the bottom, and the palaces felt the loss in the one currency they could not buy their way out of, the plain absence of hands. What the war began, the peace made permanent. In the early 1920s, the country slammed its doors on immigration, cutting off at the source the stream of new arrivals who had always refilled the servants' halls. The supply of cheap hands, already thinned by the war, now had no way to renew itself. A family could still find servants, but it had to pay them more and command them less, and a house built to be run by 40 could no longer be staffed at any price its owners were willing to bear. The bargain between the great house and its servants had reversed. For 50 years, the house had held all the power in it, offering a bed and a few $100s a year and taking obedience and invisibility in return. Now the servant held a card the house had never allowed him before, the simple ability to leave for something better. Wages rose. Deference fell. A mistress who had once chosen among a dozen applicants for a single place now struggled to keep the places she had already filled. A world arranged for the comfort of the few had rested on the resignation of the many, and the resignation was gone. And over all of it fell a colder shadow from the east. In 1917, the Russian Revolution swept away an empire, and the next year, the Romanovs, the reigning family of one of the oldest thrones in Europe, were shot in a cellar and their bodies hidden away. For the American dynasties that had spent 40 years imitating aristocracy, buying titles and chateaux, and calling their houses palaces, the image was unbearable and impossible to forget. An aristocracy could be killed. It had just happened to the grandest family on the continent, within living memory of the ball that broke Mrs. Astor's door. Conspicuous wealth, which had read as confidence for a generation, began to read as exposure. The whole meaning of display had inverted. The marble palace and the army of servants had been built to announce that a family stood above the ordinary run of life, secure, permanent, aristocratic. in a decade that had watched a real aristocracy murdered and taxed the survivors at 3/4. The same display began to look like recklessness, even like a provocation. The leisured order the great houses existed to put on show, the whole idea that some families were born to be served and others born to serve, was quietly ending, and the houses were suddenly too large for the world that remained. The war took the servants from the basements and the certainty from the drawing rooms, and it did one thing more. It put the sons of the great families into the paths of the age's most magnificent and most dangerous machines. Some of them went to the water, and the water had already taken the first of them 2 years before the first gun was fired on a clear, cold night in the North Atlantic, aboard the ship the age had called unsinkable. Chapter 14. The princes the sea took. The 2 greatest fortunes in America each put a man aboard the 2 most famous ships in history, and the sea kept them both. On the night of the 14th of April, 1912, the largest moving object ever built by human hands struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and began, across 2.5 hours, to go down by the head. Aboard her was John Jacob Astor IV, the richest passenger on the ship, and, by the reckoning of the day, one of the richest men in the world. His estate would be counted at some $87 million. He had built a hotel called the Astoria beside the one his cousin owned and joined the 2 names into the Waldorf Astoria, a monument to the family's grip on the island of Manhattan. On the coldest morning of his life, none of it bought a seat in a boat. His body was pulled from the sea a week later, on the 22nd of April, and known by the initials sewn into his jacket. The ship itself was the age's own handiwork, the largest and most luxurious thing its industry had ever floated, sold to the public as the vessel that could not sink. The men who could afford her upper decks were the men the age had made. Isidor Straus, who had built Macy's into the greatest store in the country, went down with her too, his wife refusing a boat to stay beside him. The unsinkable ship, the emblem of everything the machinery could do, carried the emblems of the age down with it on the maiden crossing. 3 years later, the sea came back for the other fortune. On the 7th of May, 1915, a German torpedo struck the Cunard liner Lusitania off the Irish coast, and she sank in 18 minutes. Aboard was Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, a grandson of the Commodore, heir to a share of the railroad fortune. Survivors said afterward that he gave his own lifebelt to a woman with a child and helped others toward the boats while the deck went under him. The account is the family's, and it cannot be proven, but the fact at its center is not in doubt. He drowned, and his body was never found. So within 37 months, the 2 greatest fortunes in America each lost a man to the 2 most famous shipwrecks in history. Both men were heirs to money the previous century had made, born into fortunes they had not built themselves. Both drowned on the era's proudest machines, the fast luxury liners that were the furthest reach of the industrial fortune, one killed by ice and one by a torpedo. The coincidence was too clean for the age to ignore, and the age did not ignore it. People spoke, then as now, of a cursed generation, of money that carried its own doom across the water. There was a particular horror in it for the people who read the passenger lists over breakfast. These were the untouchable families, the ones whose money was supposed to place them above the accidents that befell ordinary lives. A miner might drown, a soldier might fall, but an Astor and a Vanderbilt were meant to be insulated by the very thing that made them Astors and Vanderbilts. The sea did not observe the insulation. It took the richest man on the richest ship and the Commodore's grandson off the fastest liner afloat, and it did so in front of the whole watching world on the maiden voyage of one and the celebrated crossing of the other. The age had told itself that money was a kind of armor. The North Atlantic disagreed twice. The grounded explanation asks for no curse at all. The people who drowned in the first-class staterooms of the Titanic and the Lusitania drowned there because first-class passage on the newest and fastest ships was exactly what enormous money bought. The fortunes that built the liners also filled their best cabins, put the richest families in the country aboard the most advanced and most crowded machines of the age, send those machines across the most dangerous ocean in the world in a decade of ice lanes and submarine warfare, and some of the richest men will die spectacularly. The mathematics of who could afford the upper decks is a duller thing than a curse. It is also enough to account for the deaths. And yet, the pattern sat strangely on the age even so. The same industrial genius that raised the marble houses built the ship that could not sink, and the ship went down. The same wealth that could buy anything could not buy the two men back out of the water. Whether that was only chance and passenger lists, or an age whose most magnificent machines had begun to turn on the men who owned them, the people living through it could not finally say. They felt the chill of it, and they were not wrong to feel it. The Astors who did not drown were already leaving. Years before the Titanic, the head of the elder branch, William Waldorf Astor, had grown tired of America and its newspapers and its taxes. And in 1891 he lifted the greatest landlord fortune in New York and carried it to England. He was reported to have said that America was no fit place for a gentleman to live, a line the family never confirmed and the country never forgot. He bought Cliveden, the great house above the Thames, in 1893, and later Hever Castle took British citizenship, and had himself made a baron in 1916 and a viscount the year after. The dynasty that had grown rich on American ground had bought its way into the British peerage and turned its back on the republic that made it. His son's American-born wife, Nancy Astor, went further into the old country than any of them. In December of 1919, she took a seat in the House of Commons, the first woman ever to sit in it, an American heiress's fortune transmuted at last into a place in the oldest parliament in the world. The Astors had made their money as the ultimate insiders of New York and ended as English lords and a lady of the Commons. The most permanent-seeming American fortune had survived by ceasing to be American at all. The Goulds were spared the sea and lost the money anyway, drained from both ends inside a single generation. Jay Gould had died in 1892, leaving some $72 million to 6 children and no instruction to hold it together. His daughter Anna married a French count, Bonnie de Castellane, in 1895, and the count poured her Gould money into a pink marble palace in Paris and a life of open extravagance, some $10 million of it gone before she divorced him in 1906. Her brother George inherited the railroads, and the ambition without his father's timing stretched the system toward the coast and watched the panic of 1907 push its key lines toward the receivers. In 1915, he was forced out of the Missouri Pacific, and the Gould Railroad empire was finished. By the time the guns stopped in Europe, the 3 great fortunes were quieter than their houses let on. The Astor money had emigrated. The Gould money had been spent by a countess and lost by her brother. The Vanderbilt money still filled the mansions and the yachts, but it was being divided with every death and taxed with every division, and its railroads had passed into other hands. The fortunes still looked whole from the street. They were being hollowed from the inside, and the age had one more blow to deliver, the largest of them all, and it was coming in the autumn of 1929. Chapter 15. The third generation spends it all. The age had a proverb it never believed could touch it, and in 1929 it came true. On the 3rd of September that year, the stock market reached the highest point it had ever touched. A summit the age read as simple confirmation that the good times were the natural order of things. 7 weeks later, it broke. The selling came in waves with names the country would remember: Black Thursday and Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the last week of October, and the men on the floor of the exchange shouted into a falling tape that no buying could hold up. It did not stop that autumn or that year. It did not stop for nearly 3 years. The numbers of the collapse are almost hard to hold. The market that had peaked in September of 1929 kept falling until the summer of 1932, and when it reached bottom, it had lost roughly 89 of every $100 it had once been worth. National output fell by about a third. 1 worker in 4 had no job. The fortunes that had been converted over the previous decade out of operating railroads and into portfolios of stocks and bonds now watched that paper evaporate, while the taxes, the staff, and the upkeep on 3 or 4 great houses each went on costing exactly what they had always cost. The market would not climb back to its 1929 height until 1954, a quarter of a century later. The Depression finished the fall rather than starting it. Tax and cost and the war and the slow dividing of the money had been at that work for 20 years already. The crash only completed it, fast and in public, on families that had been weakening for a generation behind their marble fronts. A fortune that threw off less income every year and paid out more in tax at every death could carry its fixed costs as long as the underlying capital held. When the capital fell by 4/5 in 3 years, the arithmetic that had merely been tightening became fatal. The age had a name for what was happening to it, and the name was older than the age itself. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, the saying went. The first generation building the fortune, the second displaying it, the third spending it and returning the family to where it started. The Gilded Age had heard the proverb and laughed at it, certain that marble and railroads and a place on a list of 400 names had lifted it clear of any folklore about money. The proverb was patient. It had arithmetic on its side. The mechanism underneath the saying was plain enough. The man who builds a fortune knows what it cost and guards it. His children, raised in the house he built, learn to display it. His grandchildren are born into a world where the money simply exists, like weather, and they are trained by every day of their lives to spend it and by nothing to make it. Set that habit beside the plain arithmetic of a fortune cut into 8 parts, then 30, then 100, and the wonder is that anyone expected a different ending. The age had built its dynasties on the belief that money once concentrated stayed concentrated. Money does not stay anywhere. It has to be held, and holding is work, and the 3rd generation had been raised to do everything with money except the work of keeping it. The Vanderbilts proved it, almost to the letter. The Commodore had died in 1877, leaving about $100 million, more than the United States Treasury then held, and rather than splinter it, he passed some $95 million whole to a single son, William Henry, on the theory that dividing a fortune destroys it. For 1 generation, the theory held. William Henry roughly doubled the money to near $200 million in under 9 years and died the richest man in the world. Then he did the thing his father had feared. He divided the estate among his widow and 8 surviving children, and each of those shares divided again in the generation after. And the pieces went into mansions and yachts and dowries and the wages of 40 servants a house, rather than back into anything that would grow. The splitting did in 3 generations what no market could have done in 1. Within about 30 years of the Commodore's death, no Vanderbilt stood among the richest men in America. The railroads that had made the money passed into other hands. The fortune that had been the largest in the country was still large, spread among dozens of heirs, but it no longer sat at the top of anything, and it was still shrinking, divided and taxed, and spent faster than it could ever compound. The palaces made the fall visible faster than any ledger. A house, like the largest of the Vanderbilt mansions, had been built to be run by nearly 40 servants and to swallow a fortune every year in coal and wages and repair. And it made sense, only as long as the money behind it was endless and the servants cheap. By the 1920s, the money had limits, and the servants were gone to other work, and the great houses that had proclaimed the family's permanence became the heaviest things it owned. A family that had built the largest house in the city discovered, inside a single lifetime, that it could no longer afford to heat the rooms it had raised. The most quoted emblem of the ending is a scene from Long After. One member of the family later wrote that when the Vanderbilts held a reunion at Vanderbilt University in 1973, around 120 descendants came, and there was not a millionaire among them. The claim traces to a single book by a single relative, and it cannot be checked, and it should be held as family law rather than fact. But the direction of it is true beyond dispute. The greatest fortune of the Gilded Age had been divided into ordinary lives inside a century. The families themselves did not vanish. Vanderbilts and Astors and Goulds went on being born, marrying, working, living lives that would have been unimaginable luxury to almost anyone else, and were merely comfortable by the standard their name had set. What vanished was the thing the age had actually built, the claim to permanence pressed into limestone up and down Fifth Avenue. The houses had been raised to outlast 1,000 years. They did not outlast the men who raised them by 50. And in the winter of 1926, while the last of these fortunes were still counting what the crash had left them, the wrecking crews were already coming up the avenue, climbing down from their trucks in front of the marble palaces to begin taking them apart. Chapter 16. The names came off the doors. Between 1926 and 1927, the wrecking crews came up Fifth Avenue and took the palaces down one by one. They came with derricks and iron balls and long ladders, and they worked in the open, in daylight, while the traffic went past. The men who built these houses had meant them to stand 1,000 years. The men who took them apart needed a season. On the corner where Fifth Avenue met 57th Street stood the largest private residence ever raised in New York, the house that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had bought a whole block to build, so that no rival could ever rise higher than his own roofline. In 1926, the family sold it. The land alone brought about $7 million, more than the house had ever been worth as a home, and the buyers did not want the house. They wanted the ground. By the next year, the roof was open to the sky, and the carts were carrying the marble away. For 40 years, the avenue between the low 50s and the low 60s had held an almost unbroken wall of limestone and marble, and the newspapers had called it Millionaire's Row, and its Vanderbilt heart they had called Vanderbilt Row, and it had been raised to stand as long as any street in Europe. In a little more than a year of steady work, most of it was gone. Where the Great Hall had been, the builders framed a store. Bergdorf Goodman opened on the site in 1928, and the women who had once been turned away at that door now walked in freely to buy gloves. A few blocks south stood the grey limestone chateau that William Kissam Vanderbilt had raised in 1882, the house whose costume ball had cracked open New York society in a single night. It went the same way in about 1926. It had stood for less than 45 years. Farther along the avenue, the double mansion that Mrs. Astor had shared with her son, the throne room of the 400, came down around 1926. And on the ground where the most exclusive ballroom in America had stood, the congregation of Temple Emmanuel raised a synagogue. The house built to keep the wrong people out became a house of prayer with its doors open. William Henry Vanderbilt's Triple Palace crumbled slowest of all, the northern half in 1927, and the southern half not until the late 1940s, so that for 20 years a part of it stood while the rest was already gone. Before the crews ever came, most of the houses had gone dark. A palace of 100 rooms needs an army to keep it lit and warm, and that army had scattered into the factories, into the war, into a country that no longer produced servants by the thousand. So the great houses stood shuttered along the avenue for years, curtains drawn, gates chained, the marble facing gone grey with soot, while the shops and the office towers rose around them. A family's monument had become a family's burden. Some heirs could not sell and could not afford to open them, and so they simply waited, paying the taxes on an empty stone mountain until a developer offered enough for the land beneath. Then they let it go. One by one, the greatest houses in America came onto the market as vacant lots with a mansion still standing in the way. There was one part of the work the crews had learned not to think much about. High over each door, cut into the lintel in letters deep enough to outlast 1,000 years, was the family name. It was the oldest claim the age had made, that a name in stone could not be moved. The crews moved it. Some names were chiselled off the block and the blank stone set back into a wall somewhere else. Some were loaded onto the carts with the rest of the rubble and carted off for fill. The marble had been quarried to say a family would stand forever. It outlasted the family by an afternoon. The stone, it turned out, was the permanent thing, and the name was the passing one. Walk up Fifth Avenue today, from the 50s into the low 60s, and you will find no trace of the wall. You can stand on the exact corner where the largest house in the city once filled a whole block, and there is nothing to tell you it was ever there, only a department store, a bank, a tower of glass, the same shops that stand on every rich street in the world. You will not find the marble. You will not find the name. The city that made the Vanderbilts had, inside a single lifetime, erased even the memory of where they had lived. Newport was different, and only because someone stepped in. The great cottages had outlived the family's ability to keep them. Taxes rose. The servants who had run them by the dozen were gone for good. And a 70-room house on the ocean cost a fortune to heat for the few weeks anyone used it. Some were sold. Some were closed. Some were simply left. Then, in 1948, Cornelius II's daughter did a strange and quiet thing. Gladys Vanderbilt, who had married a Hungarian count and become the Countess Szechenyi, leased the breakers, the grandest of all the cottages, the palace her father had built for a reported $7 million to a young preservation society for $1 a year. The society opened the first floor to anyone who could buy a ticket, and the family kept the rooms upstairs. A house built to overwhelm the public was handed to the public for $1. Years later, in 1972, the same society bought the breakers outright for $365,000, less than the family had once spent to build a single room of it. The grandest of the cottages had become a ticket at a gate. That was the shape of survival. The houses that still stand on the avenue and on the cliff survived on one condition, that they stopped being homes. The breakers became a museum. Marble House was bought by the same society years later. In the city, the few mansions spared the ball became embassies and schools and galleries, a foreign cultural office in one, a university building in another, a jeweller's counter in the old Morton plant house. Not one of the great trophy houses of the Vanderbilts survived as a place a Vanderbilt lived. For the house to last, the family had to be emptied out of it. Chapter 17. The golden thing that ate its own. The Gilded Age did not simply end. It did to its own dynasties exactly what it had done to everything it touched. Where the largest house in New York had stood, a store now sold gloves and perfume, and the shoppers crossing its marble floor did not know they were walking across the footprint of a dynasty. That was the age's own method, turned at last on itself. It had always bought and built and torn down and built taller. In the end, it did all of that to the very families who had set the machine in motion. They had thought they were the owners of the machine. They were only its fuel. It was not killed by reformers or by revolutionaries or by any hand from outside. It was consumed by the very machinery that had raised it. Every force that lifted the dynasties was the same force that brought them down. The untaxed money that built the fortunes was met by the income tax and the estate tax that quietly unwound them, a claim on the bloodline at every death. The system with no central bank, the one that let a single old banker in a private library hold up the whole country, was met by the panic that proved no country should rest on one man's nerve, and by the Federal Reserve that took his place and retired his kind. The wealth spent as spectacle, the wealth that made the families admired, the marble and the balls and the palaces on the cliff, was met by the fixed costs of that same spectacle, the taxes and the staff and the upkeep on houses too large to heat, which an age of depression could no longer carry. Each gift had been a debt. Each engine ran, in the end, in reverse. That was the machine the age had built, one that turned railroads into palaces, and daughters into countesses, and money into a kind of immortality. No one who stood inside it at the peak believed it could turn the other way. It turned the other way. The golden machine that had made the palaces out of railroad money now made rubble out of the palaces. It ran in reverse, and it ran perfectly. What it had given, it took back, and it took it back at the same speed it had given it, so that the whole rise and the whole fall fit inside a single 100 years. The golden thing ate its own. The three families each fell by a different road, and each road was the age's road. The Vanderbilts spent the fortune faster than it could grow, split it among too many hands, and within 30 years of the Commodore's death, not one of them ranked among the richest Americans. The Astors, whose money had seemed the most permanent of all because it sat under the ground of Manhattan itself, put a man aboard the Titanic and then sailed for England, trading away the country that made them for a title it could never grant. The Goulds were drained from both ends at once. A daughter's fortune poured into a palace in Paris, and a son's railroads lost in a panic, gone from the first rank inside a single generation. Different exits, one machine. There was a wound under all of it, and it had been there from the first day. The money was new, and in a country that pretended to have no aristocracy, new money had nothing to prove it belonged except the money itself. So it built. It built marble to say it was permanent, married its daughters abroad to borrow the permanence of a crown, threw open its ballrooms to say it could not be shut out. Every stone was an answer to the same fear, and the building was the thing that broke them, because a fear answered in marble, and staff and settlements carries a cost that keeps coming due long after the fear that raised it has been forgotten. The strangest part is that the age had half known. At the top of its confidence, it had spent its evenings in darkened rooms, paying mediums to reach the husbands and the children it had buried. An age with more money than any before it, and no way to buy back a single lost face. It had sensed a reckoning it could not name and could not price. It built in marble against that feeling. It threw the largest parties the country had ever seen against that feeling. And still the feeling was right. The houses raised to prove a family had conquered time became the clearest proof that no one had. An age that had spent its nights trying to speak with its own dead had within a lifetime joined them. Near the beginning of all of it, a Vanderbilt had said 3 words the age never lived down. Asked whether the public had any claim on how he ran his railroads, William Henry Vanderbilt was quoted as answering, "The public be damned." The fuller sentence around it may have been the reporter's invention, but those 3 words were his, and the age wore them like a motto, the whole ethic of an era boiled down to a single breath. It ran its railroads and raised its houses and shut its door as though the public did not matter and never would. And then the public strolled past the rubble to shop. The age had damned the public. In the end, it was damned along with it. The workmen had reached the ballroom last. It was the largest private ballroom ever built in New York, raised to hold the 400 people who were said to matter. And barely 40 years after the first guest climbed its stairs, the iron ball swung through it. There was no ceremony. There rarely is. For the end of a thing that believed it would never end. The marble came down onto the carts. The name came off the door. And where the great hall had stood, a store threw its doors open to anyone with money to spend, which was the one aristocracy the age had never learned how to close. The Golden Age had built its own coffin in marble, and carved its name across the lid to last 1,000 years, and lain down inside it in under 100. The stone outlived the name. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stay for the next one. And tell me this, if you had stood inside a fortune that size, would you have believed it could ever end? Which family fell the hardest? The Vanderbilts, the Astors, or the Goulds? Tell me where you are watching from.